I never thought I'd need a bodyguard. I'm not a celebrity, and my job isn't particularly dangerous, but after some anonymous threats and a vandalism incident at our house, I didn't have a choice. That's how David came into our lives. David was professional, ex-military, and came highly recommended. He had the imposing look you'd expect, tall, muscular, and no-nonsense, but he wasn't intimidating. He had this easy charm that made you feel at ease. Even Sarah, my wife, seemed comfortable with him right away. "You've really gone all out with this," Sarah joked the day David arrived. "A bodyguard? What's next, a panic room?" At the time, we both laughed. It felt like an overreaction, but I wanted to protect her, to protect us. I had no idea I was opening the door to something far worse. At first, everything seemed fine. David stuck to his role, shadowing me at work events, keeping an eye on the house when I traveled, and making sure Sarah felt safe. She even told me once, "I like having him around. He's good company." I agreed. David was a good guy, someone you could trust. Or so I thought. Looking back, the signs were there. Sarah started dressing up more, even when she wasn't going out. She and David shared jokes at the dinner table, and she laughed just a little too hard at his stories. I brushed it off as harmless. I mean, he was our bodyguard. Why would I suspect anything? It wasn't until I left for a 2-week business trip that things started to unravel. Sarah and I talked every night, but by the second week, she seemed distant. "I've just been busy," she said when I asked why she hadn't answered my calls right away. She reassured me everything was fine, adding, "David's been a huge help around here." Her words sounded normal, but something in her tone didn't sit right with me. When I got back, I found David's jacket hanging in the kitchen and his coffee mug on the counter. He left quickly after I arrived, and Sarah barely explained why he'd been there all day. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the way David had rushed out of the house when I returned. Normally, he'd stick around, give me a rundown of how things went while I was away, and we'd chat for a bit. This time, he barely said a word before grabbing his jacket and leaving. And Sarah, her reaction didn't sit right with me either. She seemed almost nervous. She smiled a little too much, talked a little too quickly, and avoided eye contact every time I tried to ask about the week I'd missed. "Did anything happen while I was gone?" I asked that night as we sat at the dinner table. "Not really," she said with a shrug. "Just the usual. Work errands. David helped me fix the garage door, by the way. It's working fine now." I nodded slowly. "He was here a lot, then?" "Well, yeah," she said, not looking up from her plate. "Isn't that what you hired him for?" Her answer made sense, but something about her tone made my stomach twist. I decided to drop it for the moment, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, while Sarah was out running errands, I decided to check the home security cameras. David's job was to monitor them, but the system was set up so I could access the footage anytime I wanted. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for, but I had a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I scrolled through days of clips, most of them uneventful. David coming and going, Sarah heading out to run errands, deliveries being dropped off, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed something odd. Late one night, long after Sarah usually went to bed, I saw David's car parked in the driveway. The timestamp read 11:48 p.m. The camera in the living room caught Sarah letting him in, dressed in a robe, her hair still damp. They sat on the couch, talking. The footage didn't have sound, but the way they leaned in close to each other made my chest tighten. After a while, Sarah got up, poured them both a glass of wine, and sat back down. The conversation lasted for over an hour. At one point, she laughed, her head falling back, and playfully swatted his arm. David grinned, leaning closer. I watched in silence as the footage continued. He left at 1:12 a.m., but the image of the two of them sitting so close on that couch was burned into my mind. When Sarah came home that afternoon, I tried to keep my tone neutral. How was your day? I asked. Good, she said, putting away groceries. Just the usual errands. Why? No reason, I said, leaning against the counter. Just curious. By the way, did something happen while I was gone? Like late at night? Her hand froze for a split second before she resumed unpacking. What do you mean? I mean, I noticed David was here pretty late a few nights ago, I said, watching her reaction carefully. Oh, that, she said with a quick laugh. Yeah, I couldn't get the alarm system to stop beeping, and I didn't want to wake you up at that hour. So I called him to come fix it. It was no big deal. She didn't even blink as she said it, but something about the way she avoided looking directly at me set off alarm bells in my head. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut any longer. Something wasn't right, and I was going to find out what it was, even if I didn't like the answer. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah and David sitting so close on the couch. Her laugh, the way she leaned toward him, it all felt too intimate, too familiar. I needed answers, but I didn't want to tip her off that I was suspicious. Instead, I decided to focus on David. If there was something going on, I figured he'd be the weaker link. I called David later that day, keeping my tone casual. Hey, David, got a minute? Of course, he replied, his voice steady. I just wanted to thank you for keeping things under control while I was away, I said. I know Sarah really appreciates having you around. No problem at all, he said smoothly. It's what I'm here for. There was nothing in his tone that gave him away, but something about how quickly he responded felt rehearsed. By the way, I added, Sarah mentioned you helped her with the alarm system late one night. What happened there? There was the briefest pause. Oh yeah, he said. She called me because it kept going off. Turned out to be a sensor issue. Nothing major. Must have been late, I said lightly. Yeah, around midnight, I think, he replied. Didn't want her to feel unsafe, so I came right over. His story matched hers almost perfectly. Too perfectly. That evening, I decided to check Sarah's phone. She usually left it on the nightstand when she showered, and this time was no different. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. Her passcode hadn't changed. At first, everything seemed normal. Texts from her mom, group chats with friends, even reminders about work meetings. But when I scrolled further, I found a thread with David buried in her message history. Most of it looked innocent at first glance. Can you stop by later? I need help with something. Sure thing. Be there in 20. But then I saw a message from the night I'd found on the security footage. Thanks for coming over. I don't know what I'd do without you. His reply. Anytime. You know I'm here for you. The words made my stomach turn. When Sarah came out of the shower, I put the phone back and tried to act normal. She smiled at me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. Everything okay? She asked, drying her hair. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. But inside, I felt like the walls were closing in. I needed more proof, something undeniable. The next day, I decided to check the security footage again, this time combing through the last few weeks. It didn't take long to find more late-night visits from David. On one occasion, he arrived around 10 p.m., and didn't leave until nearly 2 a.m. Another time, they sat outside on the back porch, their heads close together as they talked. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the body language told me enough. That evening, I confronted Sarah. Have you been spending a lot of time with David lately? I asked casually over dinner. She glanced up, her expression calm. What do you mean? I mean, I noticed he's been around a lot, even late at night. Her smile didn't waver. Jake, I already told you. He's been helping out with things. You're the one who hired him, remember? Her tone was light, almost playful, but I could feel the tension building. Right, I said, setting down my fork. And those late-night visits? You needed help with the alarm every single time? Her face darkened just slightly, but she quickly recovered. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking a question, I said, keeping my voice even. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been spending a lot of time alone with David. Sarah leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You're being ridiculous. He's our bodyguard, Jake. He's here to keep us safe. Maybe if you were home more often, I wouldn't need to rely on him so much. Her deflection hit hard, but I didn't let it show. This isn't about me, I said firmly. It's about you and him. If there's nothing going on, then why are you getting so defensive? Her eyes narrowed, and her voice turned icy. I don't have to justify myself to you. If you don't trust me, that's your problem, not mine. I stared at her, my heart pounding. The way she deflected, the way she twisted the blame, it only made me more certain that I was right. That night, I decided to confront David next. The next day, I called David and asked him to meet me at a local coffee shop. I wasn't ready to confront him in the house, and I didn't want Sarah involved. I needed to see his reaction without her presence muddying the waters. David arrived on time, as always, wearing his usual calm expression. He nodded at me as he sat down across the table. Jake, what's going on? I wasted no time. I need to know what's been going on between you and Sarah. For the first time, I saw his composure falter. It was just a flicker, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a tightening of his jaw, but it was enough. What do you mean? He asked carefully. You know exactly what I mean, I said, leaning forward. The late-night visits, the texts, the time you two have spent alone while I've been away. If there's nothing to hide, then tell me the truth. David took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. Jake, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Am I? I said, my voice rising slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a hell of a lot like you're crossing boundaries you have no business crossing. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around the coffee shop, as if searching for an exit. When his eyes met mine again, I saw something I hadn't expected: guilt. I've only ever done what Sarah asked me to do, he said finally. She was lonely, Jake. You were gone, and she needed someone to talk to. That's all it was. I clenched my fists under the table. You expect me to believe that? That it was just talking? Yes, he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. Nothing happened. I wouldn't cross that line. I leaned back, studying him. His words sounded convincing, but his body language betrayed him, the way he avoided my gaze, the way his hands fidgeted on the table. If that's the truth, then why did she feel the need to lie about it? I asked. David looked down, his jaw tightening. Maybe you should ask her that, he said quietly. When I got home, I found Sarah in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. Where were you? She asked casually. Out, I said, sitting down across from her. I talked to David. Her face paled slightly, but she quickly masked it with a smile. Oh? What about? You know what about, I said flatly. He says nothing's going on, that you two were just talking. So why did you lie to me? Her smile faded, and she set her phone down. I didn't lie to you, Jake. I told you exactly what happened. No, you told me a version of the truth, I shot back. And you've been hiding things ever since. So why don't you stop playing games and tell me the whole story? Sarah's expression hardened. You're blowing this way out of proportion. David has been nothing but helpful while you've been gone. If you're insecure about that, maybe you should look at yourself instead of trying to blame me. Her deflection sent a wave of anger through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm not blaming you, Sarah, I said evenly. I'm asking for the truth. If there's nothing to hide, then why does it feel like you're covering something up? Her eyes flashed with anger. Because you're treating me like I've done something wrong when all I've done is try to keep this house running while you're off chasing your career. The argument spiraled from there, her voice rising as she hurled accusations at me about my priorities and my trust issues. I fired back, pointing out the inconsistencies in her story, the texts, the late-night visits. By the time the shouting stopped, we were both standing on opposite sides of the room, breathing heavily. "I can't do this right now," she said, grabbing her keys and storming out the door. I watched her go, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. Whatever was happening, I knew one thing for certain. The cracks in our marriage were no longer something I could ignore. The silence in the house after Sarah left was deafening. I sat in the living room, my mind racing with everything she'd said. Her deflections, her anger, it all felt like a smokescreen to avoid giving me a real answer. After pacing for what felt like hours, I decided I couldn't sit still anymore. I went upstairs to our bedroom, opening drawers and cabinets aimlessly, looking for something. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, but I felt like the truth was hiding somewhere just out of reach. Then, in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, I found it. A receipt from a nearby wine shop, dated the same night David had come over late. The purchase? A bottle of red wine, one I knew we didn't drink together. My heart sank. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was another crack in the wall of lies Sarah had built around me. When Sarah came home later that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. "Where'd you go?" I asked as she dropped her keys on the counter. "Out," she said curtly. "I needed to cool off." I nodded, watching her carefully. "Did you have anything you wanted to tell me?" She froze for a split second before forcing a casual tone. "No." "Should I?" I held up the receipt. "Why don't you start with this?" Her eyes widened briefly, but she quickly recovered. "Seriously, Jake? You're snooping through my things now?" "Answer the question, Sarah," I said firmly. "It's just a receipt," she said, crossing her arms. "I bought wine. Big deal. Wine you drank with David late at night while I was gone," I pointed out. Her face flushed, but her voice turned defensive. "You're acting like that means something. We were sitting and talking, nothing else. If you're going to let your imagination run wild, I can't help that." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "Do you even hear yourself?" "You're lying, Sarah. I can feel it." Her expression turned icy. "Believe whatever you want, Jake. I'm done explaining myself." That night, I slept in the guest room. The gap between us felt wider than ever, and I knew the only way to bridge it was to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Lying in the guest room that night, I barely slept. My mind was consumed by Sarah's deflection and how effortlessly she turned every question back on me. It was like she'd mastered the art of denial. I couldn't take another vague answer or empty excuse. I needed proof. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for Sarah to slip up. I was going to catch her in the act. That day, I installed a hidden camera in the living room. It wasn't a move I was proud of, but at this point, trust was gone, and I had nothing left to lose. If David was still coming over when I wasn't home, I'd see it. It didn't take long for the camera to deliver results. 2 days later, while I was out running errands, I got a notification on my phone. The app linked to the camera showed live footage of Sarah and David sitting on the couch. At first, their conversation looked harmless. They were sitting a safe distance apart, talking casually. But then Sarah leaned forward, placing her hand on David's arm. He didn't pull away. I watched as the tension between them became undeniable. The way they looked at each other, the subtle touches, it was all there. My stomach turned as Sarah moved closer, her voice inaudible but her body language screaming intimacy. I felt a cold wave of anger and nausea wash over me. This wasn't just in my head. When I got home later, Sarah was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She greeted me like nothing had happened, smiling as if everything was perfectly normal. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "Fine," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. I couldn't confront her yet, not without a plan. I needed to be sure the truth came out on my terms, not hers. That night, I stayed up late, reviewing the footage again and again. Watching it filled me with a mix of rage and heartbreak, but it also solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to let her keep lying to me. Tomorrow, I'd confront her with the proof. The next morning, I woke up with one goal: to confront Sarah with the truth. No more half answers, no more deflection. It was time for her to admit what was really happening. She was in the living room, scrolling through her phone when I walked in. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her. She looked so normal, so casual, like everything was fine. But I knew better now. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. Sarah looked up, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, showing her the footage of her and David on the couch. "This," I said, holding the screen toward her. Her face froze. "What is this, Sarah?" I demanded. "What's going on between you and David?" For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her eyes darted between the screen and my face as if searching for the right response. "Jake," she began, her voice shaky. "It's not what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen enough. Just tell me the truth." She hesitated, then sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Fine," she said, her tone defensive. "Yes, we've been spending time together. But it's not an affair, Jake. We were just talking. That's all." "Just talking?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You expect me to believe that after seeing this?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "I don't care what you think you saw. David has been there for me when you haven't. You're always working, always gone, and I've been left here to handle everything by myself." I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and disbelief. "So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your behavior?" "I'm not blaming you," she said, standing up. "I'm telling you why it happened. Maybe if you'd been around more, I wouldn't have needed someone else to lean on." Her words hit like a slap. "So what? David's your emotional support now?" I asked bitterly. "Or is it more than that? Be honest, Sarah. Have you slept with him?" Her face flushed red, and for the first time, she couldn't meet my eyes. "Answer me," I demanded, my voice trembling. She hesitated for a moment too long. "No," she said finally, but the lie was written all over her face. I let out a bitter laugh, stepping back. "You can't even tell the truth now, can you?" "Jake, She started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'm done," I said, my voice cold. "I can't do this anymore. You've destroyed everything." I turned and walked out of the room, her voice calling after me, but I didn't stop. That night, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay under the same roof as her any longer. Walking out of the house felt like stepping into a storm, but at least it was my storm now. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the anger, betrayal, and confusion swirl around me. Finally, I parked in an empty lot and just sat there, staring at the dashboard. What now? The question kept echoing in my mind. I'd confronted Sarah, but her refusal to tell the truth only made things worse. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do next. I called Chris, my oldest friend, who had been my sounding board during rough patches before. "Jake?" he answered, his voice cautious. "Everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I need a place to crash." "Say no more," he replied. "Come over." When I arrived at Chris's, he greeted me with a beer and a knowing look. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, motioning for me to sit on the couch. I hesitated but eventually spilled everything: the suspicions, the texts, the footage, and the confrontation. By the time I finished, Chris looked as angry as I felt. "She's lying," he said bluntly. "You know it, and so does she. This isn't on you, man." "I just don't get it," I said, staring at the floor. "Why would she do this? Why with him?" Chris sighed, leaning back. "People like David are smooth, They know how to find cracks and exploit them. But that doesn't excuse her. She made a choice, Jake. His words hit hard, but they were what I needed to hear. The next day, I called a lawyer. It felt like an extreme step, but I couldn't ignore the facts any longer. Sarah had betrayed me, and there was no coming back from it. The lawyer, Karen, listened patiently as I explained the situation. You definitely have grounds for divorce, she said. But before we move forward, you need to decide how you want to handle this, financially, emotionally, and legally. I just want out, I said firmly. I don't care about the house, the furniture, any of it. I just want to move on. Karen nodded. Understood. But don't make decisions out of anger. Take some time to think it over. That night, Sarah called me. I stared at the phone, debating whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Jake, she began, her voice soft. I know you're upset, but can we talk? Please? I clenched my jaw. Talk about what, Sarah? You've done nothing but lie to me. I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. But I love you, Jake. I never stopped loving you. Her words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to pull me back in. If you loved me, I said quietly, you wouldn't have done this. She was silent for a moment before whispering, Can we fix this? I hesitated, but the answer was already clear in my mind. I don't think there's anything left to fix, I said, hanging up before she could reply. The morning after that call with Sarah, I felt a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't relief, exactly. The betrayal still stung like a fresh wound. But it was a realization that I couldn't keep dragging this out. I called Karen again. I'm ready to move forward, I said. Whatever it takes, let's get this over with. Karen didn't waste time. By the end of the day, the paperwork was underway. The house, the joint accounts, none of it mattered to me anymore. All I wanted was a clean break. Later that week, I stopped by the house to grab the last of my belongings. Sarah was home, but I barely acknowledged her as I packed my things. You're really doing this? She asked quietly as I loaded a box into my car. I paused, looking at her. She seemed smaller somehow, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that didn't suit her. What did you expect, Sarah? I said finally. You lied to me. You betrayed me. Did you really think I'd just let that go? She opened her mouth to reply but then closed it again, her eyes dropping to the floor. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. Well, you did, I said, my voice firm. And now I have to do what's best for me. Once I left the house, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Part of me felt liberated, like I was finally taking control of my life again. But another part of me felt the weight of what I was leaving behind, years of memories, good and bad, now reduced to boxes in my trunk. I drove back to Chris's place, where he greeted me with a smirk. You look like you just unloaded a ton of baggage, he said. I let out a small laugh. Something like that. Good, he said, clapping me on the back. Now it's time to start fresh. That night, as I sat on the couch flipping through the divorce paperwork, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. I'm sorry for everything. I'll sign the papers. I just hope one day you can forgive me. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. Forgiveness felt like a distant concept, but at least this felt like the beginning of the end. A week later, the divorce papers were finalized. I hadn't seen Sarah since the day I packed my things, and I had no intention of reaching out. When Karen called to confirm that Sarah had signed, I felt a strange wave of relief. It was over. You're officially a free man, Karen said with a mix of professionalism and warmth. Thanks, Karen, I replied. For everything. Just focus on moving forward now, she said. It's time to rebuild. That night, I sat on Chris's porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the quiet street. Feels weird, doesn't it? Chris said, sitting next to me. What does? Closing a chapter like that, he said. Even when it's the right thing to do, it still messes with your head. I nodded. He was right. The anger had started to fade, but it was being replaced by something heavier, grief. Not for Sarah herself, but for the life I thought we had. The future I thought we were building together. Yeah, I said quietly. It feels empty. Chris leaned back, taking a swig of his beer. You'll fill it back up. You're stronger than this, man. You just have to give yourself time. I wanted to believe him, but it felt impossible to picture a life beyond this mess. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work and started looking for a place of my own. Staying at Chris's had been a lifesaver, but I needed to stand on my own feet again. I found a small apartment a few miles away, nothing fancy, but enough to call home. Moving in felt like the first real step toward rebuilding. I kept things simple. No pictures, no mementos, nothing that reminded me of Sarah or the life we'd shared. This was a fresh start, and I intended to treat it as one. A few weeks later, I got a call from my mom. I hadn't told her much about the situation, just enough to explain why I was no longer with Sarah. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better," I said honestly. "It's been rough, but I think I'm starting to figure things out." She paused, her tone softening. "You know, Mark and I ran into Sarah the other day." She mentioned the divorce. My stomach tightened. "What did she say?" "Not much," my mom replied. "Just that she's sorry for how things turned out." I didn't respond, unsure of what to say. "You don't have to talk to her if you're not ready," my mom added. "But I thought you should know she seems regretful." Regretful? The word stuck in my mind long after the call ended. I wasn't sure if it made me feel better or worse. That night, as I lay in my new bed in my new apartment, I realized something. I hadn't thought about Sarah all day. It was a small victory, but it felt like a step in the right direction. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally moving forward. The days started to feel normal again, though normal had taken on a new definition. My new apartment was small but quiet, and I found comfort in its simplicity. No reminders of Sarah, no shadows of the past, just me, figuring things out one step at a time. I kept busy with work, taking on extra projects to fill the gaps in my days. Chris stayed in my corner, inviting me over for game nights or dragging me out for drinks when he thought I needed it. "You're doing better than I expected," he said one night, nursing a beer at our favorite dive bar. "Am I?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Most people I've seen go through this either wallow or implode. You're still standing. That counts for something." I wanted to believe him. About a month after the divorce was finalized, I decided to try something new. I'd always loved hiking but had never prioritized it, so one Saturday, I laced up my boots and drove to a nearby trail. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that forces you to confront your own thoughts. At first, my mind drifted back to Sarah, how we'd done this together a few times in the early years of our marriage. But instead of sadness, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like those memories belonged to someone else. By the time I reached the top of the trail, with the sun setting over the hills, I felt lighter. It wasn't some dramatic epiphany, but it was enough. The next week, I started hitting the gym regularly, something I hadn't done in years. It became my new outlet, a way to channel the frustration and pent-up energy that still lingered. One day, as I finished a set, a guy at the bench next to me struck up a conversation. His name was Greg, and he'd been through a divorce a few years earlier. "Ugly business," he said when I told him my story. "But you come out stronger. Eventually." We ended up grabbing coffee after, and Greg gave me some advice that stuck. "Don't let it define you," he said. "What happened sucks, but it's just one part of your life. You've got a lot more ahead of you. Focus on that." The next time Sarah crossed my mind, it wasn't with anger or sadness. It was just a fact. A part of my past that no longer held power over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was truly moving forward. About 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Sarah for the first time since I'd left the house. It wasn't planned. I was grabbing groceries, and there she was, standing in the produce aisle, examining a bag of apples. For a second I froze. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but another part of me, the part that was tired of running, decided to face it head on. She noticed me before I could say anything. Her eyes widened, and for a moment we both just stood there. "Jake," she said, her voice soft. "Sarah," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How have you been?" she asked cautiously, as if testing the waters. "Fine," I said. "And you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay. It's been an adjustment." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence between us felt heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said during the final days of our marriage. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "For everything. I know I've already said it, but I need you to know that I mean it. I never wanted to hurt you." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact they once would have. I'd heard them before, and by now, they felt more like an obligation than true remorse. "I've moved on, Sarah," I said simply. "I hope you can too." She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she nodded. "I'm glad you're doing okay," she said quietly. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. When I got home, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Seeing Sarah again reminded me of how far I'd come, how much I'd grown since the day I walked out of our house. Chris called later that evening, asking how I was doing. "I ran into Sarah today," I told him. "No kidding," he said, surprised. "How'd that go?" "It was fine," I replied. "I think I'm finally past it." He let out a laugh. "About time. You're too good of a guy to be stuck in that mess forever." For the first time in a long time, I believed him. Over the next few weeks, I checked off more items on my list. I reconnected with old friends, took a solo trip to the coast, and even signed up for a cooking class, something I'd never imagined doing before. Each step felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was building a life that was entirely my own. That night, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, I thought about everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, it had all shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore. For the first time, I felt like I was truly free. The weeks that followed were a mix of small victories and quiet moments of reflection. Each step I took toward building a new life felt like shedding another layer of the past. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post about a volunteer program at a local animal shelter. They were looking for people to help with everything from cleaning kennels to walking dogs. I'd always loved animals but never thought about volunteering before. On impulse, I signed up. My first day at the shelter was chaotic but rewarding. The dogs were energetic, the staff was friendly, and by the end of the day, I was covered in fur and grinning like an idiot. "You've got a knack for this," one of the staff members said as I walked a particularly stubborn beagle back to his kennel. "Thanks," I replied, feeling a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in a long time. Volunteering became a regular part of my routine, and it gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of connection. Around the same time, I decided to take the solo trip I'd been planning. I booked a flight to Denver and spent a week exploring the mountains, hiking during the day and unwinding at small, local cafes in the evenings. There was something liberating about traveling alone. For the first time, I wasn't worried about someone else's schedule or preferences. I was free to do exactly what I wanted. One afternoon, as I stood at the edge of a rocky overlook, the wind whipping through my hair, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was my life now, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about what lay ahead. When I got back, I decided to check off another item on my list: learning a new language. I signed up for a beginner's Spanish class at the local community center. Walking into that classroom filled with strangers, I felt a pang of nervousness. But as the class got underway, I found myself enjoying the challenge. By the end of the first session, I'd exchanged numbers with a few classmates, and we formed a study group that quickly became another source of connection and laughter in my life. Through all of this, Sarah faded further and further into the background. Thoughts of her still popped up occasionally, but they no longer carried the weight they once did. Instead, they felt like echoes, faint reminders of a life I'd left behind. One day, while walking home from the shelter, I realized something profound. I wasn't just moving on. I was thriving. Months passed, and the pieces of my new life began to settle into place. The anger and heartbreak that had once consumed me were now distant memories, replaced by a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. The animal shelter had become a second home, and I'd even started fostering a dog named Max, a scrappy mutt with endless energy and a knack for making me laugh. He quickly became my companion on hikes, road trips, and lazy evenings on the couch. One day, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of Sarah and me popped up, vacations, holidays, candid moments that had once meant everything. But instead of feeling a pang of sadness, I simply smiled and moved on. Those memories were a part of my story, but they didn't define it anymore. At the gym one evening, Greg pulled me aside. "You've got a different energy about you," he said. "How so?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. "You just seem lighter," he said with a grin. "Like you've finally let go of all the crap that was weighing you down." I nodded, realizing he was right. Letting go hadn't been easy, but it was worth it. Later that week, I took another step out of my comfort zone, attending a networking event at the community center. It wasn't something I normally do, but I figured it couldn't hurt to meet new people. I ended up chatting with a woman named Claire, who was also rebuilding her life after a rough divorce. Our conversation was easy, filled with laughter and shared experiences. By the end of the night, we exchanged numbers, promising to grab coffee soon. As I sat on my balcony that night, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, for the strength I'd discovered within myself, and for the life I was building, one that was mine, fully and unapologetically. The betrayal that had once defined me was now just a chapter in my story. And while it had shaped me, it didn't control me anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living.